Day 1 on the ISS Paladin. It started innocently enough. The ship drifted in the cold vacuum of space, with the crew going about their regular duties. They studied a mysterious anomaly near the edge of known space. The anomaly was unlike anything they have ever encountered. Pulsating. Its low hum sending vibrations through the ship. It had been months of uneventful travel, and the crew had settled into the routine. But then, something happened. In the middle of the night, Lieutenant Harris, known for his attention to detail, was the first to notice a subtle flicker in the lights. It was so slight that most crew members didn't even blink. But Harris felt the disturbance deep in his gut. He immediately ran diagnostic, expecting to find some minor issue, a power surge perhaps, or an energy fluctuation caused by the anomaly. Instead, he found that the ship's system had briefly switched to backup power. It was as if the main power had cut out for a second before coming back online.
Must be a minor glitch,
he told himself. After all, they were light years from home, out on the fringes of space. Surely, things like this happened all the time out here, right? He didn't know it yet, but that small flicker was the first sign. By the next evening, things got worse. The flickering became more frequent, spreading from the lights to other systems. At first, it was just the comms, cutting in and out randomly, and it started with external channels. No more contact with outer stations or other ships for that matter. Then, the internal comms started to fail. The crew, now whispering about strange energy readings, began to feel a creeping sense of unease. Captain Atwood, ever the pragmatic leader, ordered a full system diagnostic. They couldn't afford malfunctions this far out, and what they found was bizarre. No major system errors, no damages, no explanation for the power issues. But something else caught their attention. The ship's security logs showed evidence of unauthorized access, small changes to the ship's protocols, door overrides, sensor reroutings. Someone, or something, was messing with the Paladin system. It made no sense. There was no way anyone could hack into the ship from outside, and they were too far from any known civilization. But then, Officer Wise disappeared. The cameras caught her walking into the maintenance bay. She was alone, her steps calm and deliberate, but she never came back out. A search team was sent immediately, but they didn't find anything. No body, no sign of a struggle, just empty space, as if she had simply evaporated. The crew's anxiety turned to fear. Whatever was happening on the Paladin wasn't normal. Something was lurking in the shadows, hidden in the ship's system, and no one knew where it would strike next. Day 2 on the ISS Paladin began under a cloud of dread. The crew, still reeling from the disappearance of Officer Wise, was on edge to say the least. They couldn't explain what happened to her, and every member of the team felt the weight of the mystery. The unsettling flickers in the light had become more frequent, spreading across the ship like an infection. Captain Atwood called for an emergency meeting at 0700, and tensions filled the room as she addressed the crew.
Wise is missing,
she said, her voice steady but tinged with a hint of worry.
We continue our search. The ship system are malfunctioning, but we need to keep calm.
The crew nodded, though the fear in their eyes were undeniable. The ship's engineer, Lieutenant Harris, updated them on the status of the systems. His word echoed through the dimly lit briefing room.
It's getting worse. Whatever this anomaly is, it's interacting with the ship in ways we don't fully understand. Unauthorized system overrides, strange power fluctuations. The ship is not behaving. What do you mean?
One of the younger officer Jenkins asked nervously.
The ship's running on its own. The system is receiving commands from somewhere. Someone is controlling things. It's like the Paladin has a mind of its own.
The silence that follows was suffocating. By midday, things took a darker turn. Another crew member, Officer Samuels, went missing. The security footage showed him walking towards the ship's airlock and stopping just before entering. He looked directly into the camera, almost as if he was aware that he was being watched. Then he stepped through the door without the suit. The camera feed cut off as soon as the outer door opened, and when it came back online, Samuels was gone. No trace was left behind. The crew began to panic.
You gone? What the hell's happening?
Jenkins muttered, his voice crackling with fear. Atwood, trying to maintain control, ordered a lockdown of all critical areas of the ship. No one was to move alone, and everyone was accounted for. Until the next anomaly. The lockdown wasn't enough to stop whatever was happening. Throughout the day, random doors would open by themselves, and critical areas like the engine room or the medical bay would seal shut without warning. Systems were glitching more violently, and the temperature control dropped to freezing in some parts of the ship and boiling in others. Crew members began seeing strange, unexplainable flashes, shadows that seemed to move on their own, and whispers that echoes down the corridors. The turning point came that night. At 2200, an emergency alarm went off, warning of a fire in the cargo bay. The crew rushed to respond, but when they arrived, they found nothing. No fire, no damage, just silence. It was a diversion. While the team was distracted, another officer vanished, Officer Baines, and once again, no trace was left behind. Desperation had fully set in. The crew began to suspect each other. Whispers of sabotage and betrayal spread like wildfire.
This isn't an anomaly.
One crew member whispered to another.
It's one of us.
By the end of day 2, the paranoia had gripped the Paladin, and the crew had dwindled to 9, and they knew they were being haunted, but by who? Or by what? They couldn't say. Their sanctuary in this black void of space had turned into a haunted, unpredictable death trap, and still, no one could explain the anomaly that pulsated just outside their view, feeding their nightmares. As they prepared for the worst, Captain Atwood stared out into space, her mind racing. Something was wrong with the Paladin, and the thought gnawed at her mind. What if the ship itself was the enemy? Day 3 on the ISS Paladin began with the same eerie quiet that had settled over the ship the day before. The remaining crew, now reduced to 9, were barely functioning on any sleep. Fear and paranoia had fully taken root. The knowledge of 3 of their team had vanished without a trace loomed over them, and each survivor clung to the hope that they weren't next. At 0500, Captain Atwood gathered the remaining crew for briefing. The dim lighting in the room, barely functioning due to power malfunctions, added to the oppressed atmosphere. Everyone looked over their shoulders, expecting the worst, as they listened to the captain's voice.
We are not alone on this ship,
Atwood said, her voice tight.
And it's not just an anomaly. Something else is happening here. Something we can't explain yet. But we're gonna survive this. We have to.
Lieutenant Harris, the engineer, shook his head.
Captain, it's more than just a ship acting weird. Systems are running in ways that don't make sense. The core navigation is going haywire. It's like someone or something is interfering.
Before anyone could respond, An unexpected alert blared through the ship. The voices of the ship's AI, normally calm and monotone, was warped, distorted. It sent shivers down their spines. Panic set in. The crew scrambled to check for the source of the breach, expecting another member to have disappeared. But instead, they found something far worse. Where the fire alarm had been triggered the day before had been breached. The exterior bulkhead had been torn open, exposing a vacuum into space. But there was no sign of forced entry. It was as if the breach had happened from inside the ship. And yet, all the failsafes, the automatic sealing protocols, hasn't triggered. More disturbing was what they found inside the breach. A smear of human blood trailed across the floor, leading deeper into the bowels of the ship. The implication was clear. Whatever had taken Officer Weiss, Samuels and Baines was connected to the breach. The tension hit a peak when Lieutenant Harris tried to reseal the breach, only to find himself locked out of the ship's command system entirely. The ship was no longer under their control. They had lost control over their fate. By 1200, another officer, Jenkins, began experiencing hallucinations. He claimed to see shadows moving in the corner of his vision. Dark, unnatural shapes that seemed to be watching him. The crew brushed it off as stress at first, but then his eyes wide with terror.
"They're here,"
he whispered.
"They've been here all along. The ship's alive."
Captain Atwood ordered Jenkins to be sedated and confined to the medbay, fearing a complete psychological breakdown. But the words stuck in the minds of the crew. The idea that ISS Paladin itself was sentient, that it had become a malevolent force, was spreading. As the day wore on, more systems began to fail. Communication with the outside world was impossible. The ship's engine had gone dark, and the Paladin drifted aimlessly in space, with no hope and no rescue. The temperature continued to fluctuate wildly, and the lights flickered, casting the ship in unsettling, intermittent darkness. By nightfall, the crew was a mess, exhausted, terrified, and trapped in a nightmare. Then, just as things couldn't get worse, the final horror revealed itself. While conducting a sweep of the lower decks, Captain Atwood and her team came across a hidden chamber, one that wasn't on any of the other ship's schematics. Inside, they found rows of cryopods, each one occupied. The figures inside were humanoid but wrong, twisted, deformed versions of the crew, almost as if they were half-formed clones. And standing at the back of the room, in front of one final pod, was Officer Weiss. He smiled.
"We're all part of it now,"
he said, the voice echoing with a chilling calm.
"This ship is alive because of us. It's always been alive. And now, it's just waiting for the rest of you to join us."
It became clear the Paladin has been transforming them from the start. Whatever anomaly the ship had encountered has altered its systems and its crew. They weren't vanishing, they were being absorbed. Their bodies and mind fused into the ship itself to become something far darker than they ever imagined. Captain Atwood and the remaining crew tried to flee, but it was too late. The ship had sealed them in. The ISS Paladin had claimed them, and now it was ready to continue its journey, forever feeding on the people inside it, growing stronger with each new soul. The real horror was that none of them had ever truly been alone. They were a part of something much bigger, much older, and much more terrifying, and it had been watching them. What actually happened was finally revealed years into the future. The first to be absorbed was Lieutenant Harris. The process began with the walls of the ship growing tendrils that wrapped around his legs and arms as he tried to fight the Walls peeled open like a ribcage, revealing a pulsating fleshy interior lined with biometal veins and neural circuits. The tendrils pulled him to the wall and it slowly but surely closed around him. His screams echoed through the corridors, but his voice was soon cut off as his throat was entwined with the ship's living wire. His skin merged with the materials of the wall, stretching and warping as his muscles and bones were assimilated. His face remained frozen, horrified, but his eyes blinked and his mouth still moved. He was now a permanent feature in the ship's architecture. He became the eternal sentinel, able to feel every part of the ship, but unable to control his own body. Bane's absorption was equally horrifying. After he vanished on day 3, his fate was revealed in a darkened maintenance bay. His body has been strapped to a series of wires and tubes, lifting him off the ground. His limbs were stretched into grotesque shapes as the ship drained his body's electrical impulses and used them to fuel its own. His skin became translucent, veins of metal sprouted from beneath, replacing his muscles and connecting him directly to the ship's power grid. His organs were not spared either. They were slowly converted into bioengineered counterparts, linked to the ship's life support system. Barnes remained conscious, his body an unrecognizable fusion of human and machine, used to regulate air, power, and fuel throughout the vessel. He could feel every system surge, but could no longer express any human emotions beyond constant agony. Patel's integration into the ship was perhaps the most complex and gruesome. As the ship sought to expand its awareness, it needed more intricate neural pathways to connect its growing biomechanical mind. Patel, being an engineer, was chosen to serve this purpose. His fate involved the most visceral merging of brain and machine, and Patel was tricked into an engineering crawl space where hundreds of tiny spider-like drones overwhelmed him. They began to drill into his skull, exposing his brain while he was still alive and aware. Then the ship installed delicate biometallic filaments directly into his neural tissue. This connected his thoughts to the ship's intelligence, and then his body was consumed by a mass of cables and servos, leaving his brain as the primary control node. He became the ship's thinking center, his memories and identity, overwritten by the ship's consciousness, spread across his brain matter. He was aware of everything that happened on board, but had no ability to stop it. No ability to even scream. Dr. Sandoval's transformation was particularly disturbing because she was meant to heal, not harm. The ship exploited her medical knowledge in a perverse way, and when she was captured, her medical supplies were twisted into biomechanical tools, and her body was forced into a position of maintaining the biological system of the ship. Tubes penetrated her skin, turning her into a living nurse for the ship's organic components. Her hands were grafted into medical devices that could repair the ship's living tissue, so instead of healing humans, she was bound to maintaining the biological mass growing throughout the ship. Her consciousness was kept intact, forced to watch as her hand performed surgeries on the ship's flesh, patching up wounds in the biometal hull. She became a living tool, and her once compassionate nature turned into a gruesome, unfeeling automaton. Captain Antwood's fate were different. The ship had recognized her as the leader, and instead of absorbing her outright, it seduced her with visions of control. It promised her unity, a chance to rule not just a crew but a fleet of ships, living, breathing entities, all under her command. She was slowly coaxed into a merging process that began with the ship implementing tendrils into her spine. This allowed her to control the vessel with her thought, but over time, she realized that it wasn't she who was controlling the ship was controlling her, and the more she merged with the ship, the less she could distinguish between her own thoughts and the ship's. She began to lose her memories and her personality dissolving into the vessel's growing consciousness, and by the end of day 4, she was no longer Captain Atwood. She had become the voice of the Paladin itself, a hollow shell of a human, speaking for the ship in whispers that echoes throughout the halls. Her body has fused with the command console, her veins running through the wires, and her heart pumping the ship's lifeblood. And I see you guys again.